Morning, everyone. All right, just making sure you're still awake. Does anyone need to stand and get the blood going back to the bum or anything before we get going? Feel free to. I won't say anything. It's all good. Okay. Well, look, as Darren said, when I was asked to present at the conference, the focus for me was about personal leadership. So you've heard about thought leadership from Thomas, and you've heard about organisational leadership from Lance, and then mine is about personal leadership. So I certainly hope within that there's something useful that you can take away. But it is my 49-year-old story packed into 28 minutes, so I'll do my very best to say something useful for you. You'll notice also mine is all of its photos, and most of the photos are lots and lots of people and teams, because actually when I reflect back, that is who I am. I'm not the person with the magnificent new piece of technology that's going to change the world. What I'm interested in is how are the human beings going to be in this new world, and that's kind of started from the beginning. So let's start from the beginning. Only time you're ever going to see me in a bathing suit in public, people. But this is me growing up in Christchurch, born in Wellington actually, but brought up in Christchurch. And I think the first slide is really around who was I as a child. And my mother tells me a lot that I did things like explaining my symptoms to the doctor when I was 4. So I was always very mouthy. That hasn't changed. And it's gone on in my life in many ways. But when I think about my childhood, it was a great childhood. I have no crucible moments. I have no terrible thing that happened to me, nor do I have any unusually amazing things that happened. Really, I had what I'd call a good, normal Kiwi upbringing. But when I do reflect back, I can see now that my mother, as it is for so many of us, our parents are our role models. And my mother worked when I was a child, and my mother had her own separate bank accounts, and she drove, her Morris Minor, and she was the person who insisted that I had my driver's licence the minute I turned 15 back in the day. So, you know, she was one of these people that now when I look back in that day and age was probably fairly forthright and bold in her approach. And I probably think my, and I do call it intelligent disobedience, probably came from my time being brought up with a woman who probably in her own way did those things as well. What it makes me reflect on now from a life lesson point of view is who are the role models who are around us now? Are they role models we want? Who is seeing us as a role model? And so often I have conversations, I formally mentor people in a range of different programs and organisations, and they look at me and sometimes say, oh gosh, it's so exciting to have a mentor. And my first thought is, you'll be a mentor. You might not even know it, but you will be a mentor for somebody in your family, in your workplace, in your community. And a little bit talking to Lance's point, what's the risk that you don't know that you're a mentor? What are people seeing in you? And that's something that's, I think, worthy of reflection. One of my old CEOs used to say to me, they even know what kind of watch I wear. And that is very, very true. People are a lot more observant, I think, of people that they see as a role model than we sometimes perhaps agree. I went on from childhood. One of my points of intelligent disobedience was I applied to sit a scholarship exam when I was 12. I kind of forgot to tell my parents that, and I did the exam and fortunately got offered a scholarship to a high school in Christchurch. It was a girls' school. It was a school where you were expected to succeed, but we still did things like sewing and cooking and all the rest, because, you know, this was the 80s, and it was that sort of life. But I look at this picture now, which is just some of the people I went to school with, and many of them are in very significant roles now: CFOs, lawyers, deputy secretaries in the public service, you know, all sorts of different roles were in that. But I think the story from my schooling that I really remember, I was head of house for my particular schoolhouse in my last year. And coming from nowhere, because my schoolhouse had not a great deal of sporting talent, coming from nowhere, we won the school swimming sports in the year that I was head of house. And the reason we won was because we got the entire house together and said, it does not matter what you do, you just have to get in the water, because you get a point if you get in the water. And they even had one for those like me who were appalling at swimming. They had the thing called the plunge. And it was just that, throw yourself off the end of the pool, if you're still alive at the end, you get a point. And I suppose the message and the life lesson I've chosen here is, and it's one we all know, you can have the usual suspects, you can have the golden children in your organisation. The minute you actually ask everyone to play, the organisation wins. And I think that's the risk. So many times we find ourselves back with the usual suspects. We have a project, here's the usual suspects who come in to work on that project. We have to trust people beyond that. But of course, you know, you do have something that goes on for you, and mine was entirely self-inflicted. You know, I managed my credit card poorly. My parents had to bail me out from that. I kind of got very excited about university, but not in the studying component of that. And so in the end, Canterbury University said, don't come back because you're not studying. And I was formally excluded at the age of 18 from university and didn't go back to university for quite some time, which in and of itself was a massive life lesson for me. This was the first time I was failing. I had cruised through high school and I had in many ways not learnt to learn. And what this brought for me was the opportunity to do that. And one of the things that I didn't know I was doing at the time, but I kept a diary at the time. We trendily call it journaling now. And it was a really important part of my lessons was when I write things down over a period of time, I start to see patterns, I start to draw conclusions. And I am the first person to encourage people to journal now, because I think it is a great way for people to see how they're evolving and to start to get some views on themselves rather than waiting for feedback from other people. But I moved on, and I'm ignoring a gap in my diary or my CV here where I did technology for quite some time, but my last major technology role was actually when I joined Bank of New Zealand and came back to Wellington in 1997. And went from a technology role through 10 years with the bank, ultimately then formally going into HR roles. So no qualifications, just wild enthusiasm. But the one thing that I did a lot of, and it started at BNZ, was I'd just say yes to everything. People would say, would you like to do? Yes. Yes, yes. And it is something that women particularly are quite bad at. We go home and we evaluate and we ask 50 people, should we say yes? And by then the opportunity's gone. And perhaps because of the early failings, I just kept saying yes. And so I did a whole raft of jobs, including being offered the opportunity to be retail sales manager for, at that time, Auckland CBD, because we got relocated to Auckland. Which meant I looked after 21 bankers across 6 branches, having only been into the branch previously to deposit money into my own account. I had no idea how to use the systems, I didn't know the products, I didn't know really how to sell, and yet here I was as retail sales manager. And I cannot begin to tell you how important those opportunities are. Terrified the pants off me. I spent the first 8 weeks working 24/7 all weekend trying to catch up and become a banker. And then I had this epiphany. I was never going to be a banker. That wasn't why they asked me to do the job. They asked me to do the job because, and the learning was, they wanted me and my skill, and I then played on what I was good at. And so the life lesson for me was know your gift, maximise your gift, don't try to be good at everything. And in fact, in doing so, that's enormously freeing and you get a whole lot more sleep. So that was very, very good from my point of view. But it does mean you have to feel the fear. And if there are people in the room in HR, we sit very comfortably in HR. And I have only learned truly how important it is to do HR differently when I have gone out of HR and seen how ridiculous some of what we suggest is. And so from that perspective, get out there, try something new. I moved on to IAG in New Zealand, back in Auckland, and I think the lesson I really took from here, this, like the previous speaker, we did introduce the human synergistics tools here. We did it because we had an absolutely immovable engagement score. We sat on 51% engagement, which was pretty horrific, for multiple years in a row, despite action plans and communications. Nothing was changing anything. And it was time to more deeply diagnose why is our organisation where it is and what needs to be different. It was a very powerful experience for us because we suddenly realised we were having different conversations, and it culminated in a deep desire of our people to learn. And that translated over time into a coaching program that the organisation took on. And the thing that was most proud for me was that 32 of our most senior leaders who had what they would call no time worked for 16 weeks to become fully accredited coaches in order to then go back into the business and do that. Now, the 16 weeks, they were still doing their day job. So they learnt this and chose to do this much in their own time. And it changed the game of the type of conversations we were having. So the life lesson for me there was you have to be relentless. We had the foot on the pedal. People kept saying to me, stop communicating. And I went, good problem to have. Good problem to have if they're telling us to stop communicating. People kept saying, we're putting too much in. No, we're not. We have to keep going, because the minute people see inconsistency, then how do you have the conversation that says, this bit over here is working, but we're actually accepting this piece over here isn't? So we did put a lot in a reasonably short period of time, and the business improved, and customer satisfaction improved, and profit improved, and employee engagement skyrocketed, and we won a Culture Transformation Award. Thanks very much, Human Synergistics. So there was a lot of good things that came from that. It also required a deep perspective from the executive team. I often use the analogy of the emperor's new clothes. There is a deep risk that executive teams run around in this little cloud of fluff where they think everybody gets it. I've said it at least once this month. And there wasn't a lot of vulnerability, there wasn't a lot of honesty, when of course the teams immediately below an executive team know everything that's dysfunctional about that executive team. And I read recently Patrick Lencioni, who wrote the book The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, said that in his view, if he only had to pick one metric in the world to assess whether an organisation was healthy, he'd pick the metric where he assessed the executive team's function. Because if you have, it's kind of like having if your parents' marriage is good, you've probably got a good childhood. It's that principle of how do you look for those positive things. So it is important that as an executive team, you're honest, you're vulnerable, you're together, you know what you're doing, and you're really real about the stuff you're not good at, and not pretending that you are good at it, and show that you're trying to change and apologise when you fail. And this team was a perfect team to do that. Very diverse, very honest, and very willing to make changes. And I think it says a lot. If I again look at the individuals in the photo, many of them have gone on to even bigger and better things. I was then shipped off to our organisation in Australia at about the time that we had a very severe problem with one of our businesses in the UK. And when the diagnosis was done on what needed to be done there, it was seen as entirely cultural, the things that had brought the organisation. Don't you notice, just as an aside, that when businesses fail all around the world, almost inevitably there is some form of strong cultural underpinning? It's not that someone forgot to plug in a number to a computer, or they forgot to do this or forgot to do that. Generally, you'll find it's because there was behaviour that was accepted in a way that has now driven an inevitable outcome. So this was an amazing organisation to be able to really experience alternatives, see what we could do, and really widen that diversity. And if there was a message that I took from working in this organisation, it was the fact that I asked to go to Harvard, and they said yes. And the lesson I took from that was ask. I can't believe how many people I work with who go, I've got this dream to do something, and I go, who have you sorted that out with? And they go, oh, no one, I've been thinking about it. You must ask. If you don't ask, you don't get. My organisation spent basically $100,000 on me to attend that amazing program, which was life-changing for me. It was also desperately intimidating. I turned up in Boston with no qualifications. The person who sat next to me on the first day had 4 degrees from London Business School. I was one of 16 women out of 106 in the program. I was one of the few women who had a 6-year-old child at home, so attending what turned out to be 2 full months in Boston while I still had a child at home. And it was game-changing for me, this program, because it taught me that I had something useful to offer, even though it was not a degree or it wasn't a fancy job title. I think HR people sometimes feel like they're not quite at the top of the list. And what I found in this process was we would debate case studies about people, and 3/4 of the room would say, that leader is amazing. And I would say, that leader needs to be fired. That leader should never have been hired. And we would have an enormous debate about it, and there would be that recognition when you go on in the case study that the leader ended up being fired because they were toxic and creating terrible outcomes for an organisation. So it is important to have those opportunities. It is important to ask for those opportunities and to show clearly how you're going to bring value when given those opportunities. And that was great for me. Coming back to New Zealand in late 2013, my next significant role was working for New Zealand Police. I was still based in Auckland, and I commuted, getting out of bed at 4 o'clock every Monday morning and getting on a plane and going backwards and forwards. I could do this, I said. My child coped with me going to Boston. I can do this, going to Wellington. Well, it turns out children are very different when they're 6 from when they're 10, and my 10-year-old was significantly less excited by the prospect of me leaving the family every week. But the real opportunity here was to think through, and the learning for me here was the difference between corporate and public service, and the difference between corporate and a job versus a public servant who has an identity. And that's the way I describe the difference between somebody who works in a business pure setting and an organisation like police, where often these people, as Darren said earlier, have decided that they're going to be police officers when they're 5. You know, it's one of those things, that's who they are. When they retire, they don't really retire. They're still police officers till they die, because that's who they are. And so one of the activities we undertook while I was working for police was a rewrite of the Code of Conduct. The Code of Conduct had been brought in as part of the Commission of Inquiry into the Louise Nicholas case. And the early Code of Conduct, which was put in early, was very much around, and I paraphrase, and flippantly I say, it said, comply, 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 or bad things will happen to you. Which, you know, is so often what codes of conduct do. They're put in as backstops just in case somebody evil in the organisation needs to be dealt to. But that doesn't work in an environment where somebody is there for the mission. Somebody is there because that's who they are. And through a very significant piece of co-design, the organisation talked through, what does it actually mean to you to be a police officer? What do you expect of yourself? What do you expect of your colleagues? When you signed up for this, which isn't just signing a contract, this is actually saying an oath, for many people on a Bible or on some other form of very belief-based recognition. They want something from their colleagues that is very, very different from a code of conduct in a corporate environment. So that was an extremely important learning for me. Everything that worked in the traditional sense in a corporate environment to motivate or at worst manipulate people along a pathway doesn't work, in my experience, in a vocationally based organisation like this, and no doubt many of you are in the room are in similar environments where there is different points of motivation and different points of need. It also presented a need for me to really question my own values when, quite simply, my life started falling apart, spending half my week in Wellington away from my family. And I had to come to that challenging realisation for myself that failure would have been to stay in the role. Failure was, and I went through a real angst about if I leave, this is failure. I've only been in the role, in the end it was 16 months, that's failure. And I had to recognise that failure would have been staying. And so made the decision to say goodbye to an organisation that I respect deeply. What I was also doing, which clearly added to the challenge, was that I was completing my part-time MBA while I was doing that role. And that was critically important to me. It was the chip on my shoulder from back at University of Canterbury, needing to be able to prove to myself that I in fact could study academically and do that well. And so it was fantastic last year when I graduated with that. And this is my lovely family, my husband and my son. And it was also really important to me that my son could see that you can get past points of failure and that you can work really hard and get an outcome that is important. And understanding my own values in an environment where we often don't talk about that anymore. Do you notice that? We use the word values. But when I often quiz people and say, what are your values? At best, people look at me blankly, or they go, honesty, integrity, family. Rolls off like one word, honesty, integrity, family. And I go, is it really? Because I was living in an environment where I don't think I was valuing my family in that way, but I probably would have rolled off an honesty, integrity, family as well. And I think we have few forums or opportunities in many of our lives now to truly explore that in a deep way. For a lot of people, they're not as connected anymore to perhaps some of the traditional places where they might have been either had values imposed or they've learned their values. And it is something that I keep reflecting on. How do we help people not learn the organisation's values? Because that's not who you are. Your decision will ultimately be your decision. So you better know where that's coming from. And it is important for fit in the future, because it is one of those things that I think more and more people are needing to discern which company, which organisation do I want to work with because I feel like I fit. Well, you're only going to know that if you can understand also what your basis of making that decision is. So these days, for the last 2 years, I've worked for Auckland DHB, and this was us on Pink Shirt Day. My chief executive, big smiley lady with the red hair on the right. It is an organisation that is deeply steeped in culture. Next year is the 500th anniversary of the Royal College of Physicians. Much of who the medical world is comes from a lot of that history. There's very few organisations that have a 500-year sort of backing. And so from that point of view, although the world is very different and people are very different, there is still tone that comes through from a lot of history. We are, in effect, an apprenticeship-based organisation. If you're a junior doctor, you come in and you ultimately learn from senior doctors. And so there's a great deal of history there that needs to be considered. We did our first employee engagement survey in 19 years last year when I arrived, and that told us that 44% of our workforce had experienced or observed bullying in the previous 6 months, nearly half. And so, that is one of our absolute focus, is how do we move our culture that is steeped in a lot of tradition to a place that does reflect where we are and who we are now and who we want to be in the future. This is critically important from our perspective because healthcare is all about empathy. It is all about supporting people with compassion and kindness, and we have to be able to extend that to colleagues as well as to patients and to people that we're working with. And we're also very aware that the World Health Organization provides stats like by 2030 the biggest measurement of disability in the world will be depression. And so, you know, the trend for mental health conditions to become a huge part of who we are, despite the fancy technology, despite the drones, we could be a very sad human race if we don't find our way through. And I would certainly say that how we're thinking for those of us in the HR world has to move beyond policies and processes and paying people. We have to be thinking about who is the human race in this new world and what does it mean for us. And I'm doing this in an environment where we have very constrained resources. Half the workforce is part-time, some of them are in, do their job, out. You know, that it is not flush with money. We have what we have and we make that work enormously well. But it means that even things like using the human synergistics tools, not something I can use today, where I could use it in corporate because the opportunity was different. But what it does mean is you can be incredibly creative. And it does mean you attract people with great passion because there's relatively little on the EVP to encourage them other than the opportunity to make a deep difference. And I am loving the types of people who are working in this environment with me. And we are making a huge difference, irrespective of those basics perhaps not being there. I often reflect back now on challenges in insurance and challenges in banking, and I go, oh, first world problems. Because then I thought that it was hard. Now I know what challenging is in this context, and we have 10,500 employees in Auckland DHB, and those people need to be incredibly looked after. And we know from deep and appropriate research, the King's Fund in the UK does very interesting research. They tell us that for every 5% improvement in the way that our teams work, we'll reduce patient death by 3.5%. We see over 1 million people a year at Auckland DHB. That's 3.5% is real people. They're your family, your friends, and it makes a huge difference for us to do the right thing for our people and to do the right thing for the people that we're serving. And we've got a long, long way to go and a very big elephant to chew through, but all we can do is chew through from the beginning. That was a plug. Anyone wants to move to Auckland, up you come. That's all good with me. So, it is important to value your values. It is important to think about how you're going to know about that. You do sometimes need to do more than excite people. Sometimes you need to outrage people to get people to move. This is something you could go and look at online. It's a campaign. The Pillion Trust in the UK had £500 left in the bank, and they were unable to keep their support of their community services going. It's sort of the idea of a lifeline shutting down because not enough money. In this environment, it was the same thing. They spent their £500 on a campaign that involved a person walking around with a sandwich board on that said, "Help the poor." Everybody ignored him. Everybody gave him great room. Nobody did anything. The next day, the same person turned up with a billboard and a sandwich board that said, "FUCK the poor," which had a remarkably different interaction set for him on that day. People turned up and abused him and were outraged and went on at how could people possibly wear a billboard like that. But everyone ignored him when it was help the poor. And we reflect a lot on, you know, people are outraged because John Campbell got taken off the air on TV3, but no one watched him. And you get outraged, I'll use a sensitive one, that Kikaldi's, you know, got bought out, but maybe it wasn't making the money to be able to keep it going. There's all sorts of situations in our life where we get outraged, but we have to think about what brought us here, and we have to think about how we can use that outrage for good. My journey itself in LSI, I'll just throw it up there. It was a really good telling opportunity for me. Over time, I had some great ups and downs. I had some great variety of different ways that people experienced me in the early days. And I managed to help through a lot of support to make that more consistent. But actually the most useful thing for me, because on the right I was feeling pretty good about myself, having lots of blue on the right-hand side. And then I did my ally, and if any of you have ever done the Leadership Impact tool, it's kind of like a Net Promoter Score where it tells you the story of what you might be doing well, but also what you might be doing that removes some of that impact, or that impacts. You could be even better if you were to make a different decision or work differently on the things that are pulling away from your value. And so for me, I look at this as a constant opportunity for learning. I still love Intelligent Disobedience. I loved Hidden Figures. Any of you watched that film this year? One of the things I loved most about this film, other than the fact I watched it on the plane and cried a lot, it was kind of embarrassing, you know how it is on a plane. The thing I loved about the fact that these women retrained themselves where they could see a different future was coming. They didn't wait for a training course. They didn't wait for being given the opportunity because they knew they wouldn't get it. So they went in after hours and taught themselves how to use the computers, and they taught themselves how to do things. I believe really significantly in that. I think New Zealand spends a lot of time competing with the shop across the street instead of looking as New Zealand Inc. as an opportunity to actually compete with the world. I ask myself the question, what is culture when half our workforce is robotic? You know, what is our culture when people are freelancers and have no need to come in? And I kind of work with a workforce like that now. How do I create a culture when I don't have everybody in the same place? And what is that need and what does that look like? How does our employment legislation work in a future where we've got to make a lot of change and a lot of difference? So what am I doing next? At the moment, I'm drafting my application to do a PhD while still doing my day job. I believe firmly that when you want something badly enough, you find the time. And so from that perspective, watch this space, there's more to come. But I'd certainly love to leave you with the message that says, who are we? What's our humanity? What does HR contribute to that in the future? Thanks very much.